Hello, my name is Alex. My partner Rico and I were hired to be consultants for the Democratic Party, and we will be going over religion's role in this year's election, as well as political theologies and historical themes that can inform us on what to do better in the future. Here's an agenda of everything we're going to be covering. First, a quick introduction covering the election, the candidate, and topics we're going to be covering today. Then, statistics and numbers from the election, describing different demographics. Then, religious assessment, describing religion's role in this year's election. And finally, next steps, where we go from here. So, first, beginning with an introduction, as we all know, Democrats lost the 2024 election, with Trump winning with 312 electoral votes compared to Harris's 226, as well as a majority of the popular vote with 1.5% over Harris. Looking at Harris specifically, she began her campaign on July 21st, 2024, when Joe Biden suspended his own campaign and endorsed Harris for president. She became the official Democratic nominee on August 5th, with her early campaign marking a shift in the political landscape. This change was praised almost across the board as an opportunity for hope and change. Donations poured in and support seemed to be going strong. So, what happened? Let's look at the election from a religious lens and examine its effects on the results we see now. First, Christian nationalism, a cultural framework that blends ethnicity, politics, and religion. It advocates for the fusion of Christianity with American civic life, emphasizing that America is inherently Christian. This is demonstrated through and is closely tied to conservative political ideology, with Trump weaponizing Christian nationalists in his favor despite not being an ideal Christian. Next, evangelicals and their political involvement. Evangelicals were initially disengaged from politics, but became more active after Jimmy Carter brought faith into the political spotlight. In the 1980s, leaders began aligning evangelicals with the Republican Party. Fast forward to Donald Trump, despite his personal flaws, evangelicals supported him due to his conservative judicial appointments, opposition to abortion, and defense of religious freedoms. Another religious factor that played a role were black churches. During her campaign, Kamala visited black churches in Atlanta, Georgia, and Detroit, Michigan, similar to one she grew up in, which represented a significant cultural and spiritual force, enabling those in those churches to go vote and offering a different perspective in faith, helping her campaign. Finally, parachurches and grassroots organizations also played a role, but we'll talk about that later in the presentation.
Okay, so let's pull up the numbers to help us better understand what happened under the hood, so to speak. So before anything, it's very important that we understand that religion is actually quite important to American voters. And interestingly enough, it is actually uniquely important among voters in wealthy developed nations. As you can see here from this chart, which tracks the per capita gross national income to how important religion is to that country's population, measured in percentages, the US voters actually rank quite high, and the general pattern that as countries become wealthier, they will experience a continuous drop in religion is not necessarily true for the United States. And for our purposes, we'll define important as influential enough to potentially sway voter behavior. And we define it like this because according to NBC exit polls, how you categorize yourself religiously can actually be a strong predictor of how you vote, and more so, and even more so than other metrics such as social class and age, as you can see here. Another interesting statistic that is worth noting is that we saw a significant decrease across the board from different religious affiliations coming out to support Vice President Harris, except from nuns, compared to the 2020 election. But much more important than just memorizing how each religious group is more likely to vote is understanding that Americans, for the most part, actually want a leader with some sort of religion, or at the very least, some type of moral grounding. As we can see here from this Pew Research study, more than 6 in 10 Americans say it is very important for them to have a president who personally lives a moral and ethical life, with 94% saying it is at least somewhat important. 7 in 10 of all Americans say it is at least somewhat important for the president to stand up for people with their own religious beliefs, and 1 in 5 say it's very important for a president to have a strong personal religious belief themselves. And only a few think that the president should share their own personal beliefs. And these results are from the 2020 election, so they are still quite relevant. Okay, so a quick summary of what we can take away from all this information. So we know that religion is a uniquely important factor to Americans in comparison to other wealthy nations. Some religious denominations can be closely tied to a political party and or political candidate, even though Americans say they will prefer a president who personally lives a moral life, they will still go out to vote for Trump, even though he is not necessarily seen as an exemplary moral person. And this part is really the part that confuses many people since it seems to be very counterintuitive. So, how does it make sense? How do we reconcile the fact that religious people will still go out in droves to vote for a morally controversial candidate over Harris? And we'll tell you why in our next section, religious assessment. Okay, so religious assessment. Now, what's going on? So, it really comes down to two problems: Harris, the secular candidate, and how Harris's personal beliefs being kept mostly under wraps actually harmed her campaign, and Trump and how he became the de facto defender of the faith. Now, what exactly do we mean by Harris, the secular candidate, and why was it such a negative? Well, Harris's efforts to appeal to a broader audience by downplaying her religious values ultimately backfired by making her seem less relatable and authentic to the general public. And as we know, Americans actually prefer to have a leader with religious values. Even worse, her rhetoric would sometimes actually come off as anti-religious and hostile to those with religious values, which Trump was quick to capitalize on. For example, Harris not attending the Al Smith dinner, which is a Catholic charity event traditionally attended by the presidential candidates, and instead opting to spend the day campaigning in Wisconsin and traveling to Michigan. Her remarks at her rally, "You guys are at the wrong rally," in response to remarks by a couple of students shouting Christian remarks, were broadcasted nationwide as a signal that her presidency would be marked by hatred towards Christians. A message that Trump was quick to capitalize on by later saying, "At Trump rallies, we don't tell Christians to get lost, we tell Christians to get out and vote." Trump, Biden, and Obama have long also understood the importance of publicly endorsing religious values, like Biden here at the bottom, offering them some protection against being attacked by these same criticisms. Now, how Trump became the de facto defender of the faith and what that means for his campaign. Ultimately, Trump, even though he himself did not lead a particularly Christian life, was free to paint himself as a defender of the faith and traditional family values, gaining endorsement from prominent Christian leaders, largely overshadowing any efforts Harris made with Christians, except within the Black church. His image as a divinely favored leader was further bolstered by claims of supernatural forces saving him during his July 13th assassination attempt, claims that were largely uncontested by the Harris campaign. By being presented as a defender of the faith, Trump also gained access to the vast network of parachurch organizations across the United States, which can best be defined as religious nonprofits who operate independently of any single congregation. Some of the benefits of these parachurch organizations include trained and experienced leadership, financial resources, established communication channels, and privileged legitimacy to his campaign.
So, next steps. What could the Democratic Party have done, and what can it do in future elections? Whether we like it or not, religion is deeply intertwined with our political system and history as a country. In my view, America is a Christian valued nation. From the beginning, founding fathers meant for Christian values to influence politics and steer the country away from corruption and greed. George Washington plainly stated, "Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can exist apart from religious principle." It's impossible to ignore these religious factors, and we must consider them in future campaigns. So first, outreach to moderate evangelicals. Trump and other New Age Republicans are already not ideal Christians, so potentially highlighting shared values and engaging with evangelical churches, leaders, and groups on bipartisan issues like opioid addiction or community building can hopefully gain some of these votes. Appealing and strengthening ties to Catholic voters can be another way to gain votes. Historically, Democrats have had the Catholic vote, but in this election, Trump appealed to many Hispanic Catholics. In the next election, Democrats can target this demographic and address specific concerns like immigration reform and economic opportunities to hopefully gain this vote back. Next, balancing outreach to religious groups with messages to secular voters is important. As the population of nones rise in America, being those that are religiously unaffiliated, addressing topics they care about and were cited as major factors in this election, such as economic policy and immigration, can win back some in the base that felt alienated during this election. Finally, continuing to mobilize faith communities and fostering interfaith dialogue is very important. This is something the Democratic Party already does well and will need to continue to do in future elections. They need to expand initiatives like Souls to the Polls to mobilize faith communities, particularly Black Christians in key swing states. One thing they could do is taking a more pro-Palestine stance, as this can increase support in the Democratic Party's younger, more diverse base, and more support in Muslim and Arab American communities, like in Dearborn, Michigan, which was a major factor in this election as they didn't turn out as much as 2020, leading to Trump winning the state. Overall, making sure different voices are heard and represented, but playing the game of the election, realizing demographics can be appealed to.